Yeah, Tuesday. I'm Eric Asilius. Welcome into HQ College Football Day. That's right, the rankings come out. Now, 25 teams get ranked, but you really need to know about the top four because being fifth is like being fourth in the Olympics. Really good accomplishment, no medal. And we want to know who's going to be on the podium this week. Should be an awful lot of fun. But before we have this week's list, let's look at last week's top four and how they did. We'll start right off the bat. Number one, it was Ohio State. Very comfortable trip for them. No Chase Young. They're a great defensive lineman and sit it out, but no problem. They win 73-14. They matched the 1973 Buckeyes with their 9th straight win by 20 or more points. They score in their first 6 possessions. It was UGLY. You ain't got no alibi for the Terps. Then we knew a top 4 team would lose because LSU and Bama went head-to-head in Tuscaloosa. Tigers, they were up 20, but they held on 46-41. Tide came roaring back, couldn't eventually get the lead against Coach Ed and company. Now, the surprise was that Penn State also lost. Unbeaten? Yeah, and they lost to an unbeaten. Minnesota, the Gophers in Minneapolis get it done 31-26. Gophers were underdogs, but they get the win, and now they become a very interesting team on how they're going to be ranked this coming week. So, entering this week, let's look at what has happened. Top 4 we mentioned, 3 and 4 both lose. 3 loses to 2, 4 loses to Minnesota. Clemson poised to move in there. Will it be Georgia? Will it be Alabama? Will it be Penn State? Now that top 6 last week correctly picked in order perfectly by the great Jerry Palm. Wondering if he can do it again. All right, there he is. So can Jerry go 2 for 2? Jerry, let's start with kind of your top 10, and clearly that 4 spot. You got to figure LSU, Ohio State, and Clemson are shoo-ins, some order 1, 2, and 3. It's really who are you going to put at 4? Who did you put at 4 and why?
Well, I went with Georgia, and the reason for that has to do with strength of schedule and quality wins. I don't think there's any doubt Georgia's loss is worse than Alabama's, having lost at home to South Carolina, and what was really kind of an ugly performance for them. But they have beaten Notre Dame. They've beaten Florida. They've definitely played a better schedule than Alabama. And I think that in the end, that's going to have Georgia ahead of Alabama this week. But as you know, 4 weeks to go, anything could happen.
All right, now this is your top 10. Now you're not predicting what you think the committee would do. You're telling me if you were Jerry Palm, czar of college football, and you got to decide it in a committee of 1, you would have Georgia in the 4 line. So let me flush it out and play devil's advocate. No, that's not right? This is what you think they'll do?
No, I am actually trying to predict what the committee will do.
Got it.
This week.
Who would you put at 4?
I would probably put Georgia at 4. I'm not impressed with Alabama's schedule. Penn State, Penn State probably got the best schedule of the 3, but the too many close games really. So that's why I'd have Alabama ahead, and Georgia's wins are every bit as good, if not a little better, than Penn State.
Why not any love from Minnesota, who beats Penn State? That's a big-time win. I mean, I know the rest of the schedule is okay at best, but they do have a big-time win. Right, I agree, but they have a big-time win. It's recent. You got to see it. They're in the Big Ten, and they're undefeated.
Okay, well, most of what you just said doesn't matter. Recent doesn't matter. The Big Ten doesn't matter. What matters is who have they played and how did they do. Now, clearly they're undefeated. They had 4 close calls at the beginning of the season. Well, all 3 of their non-conference games were close calls. Their first 8 games, that is a dreadful schedule. And, they can't help it. I mean, their league at the bottom of the Big Ten let them down to some degree. But in fact, up until the Penn State game, every team they played in the Big Ten had played a backup quarterback or worse at some point during that game. But the Penn State win, clearly, big win, prove-it game, the biggest game that Minnesota's played in nearly 60 years. So, you can't take anything away from that, but it's still just 1 win. It makes their schedule better, but not good. And, so Penn State still, the overall body of work, Penn State is still better than Minnesota. Head-to-head is a thing for this committee, but it's not everything. And you routinely see teams, that have a head-to-head result in opposite spots in the rankings. And I think you'll see that this week. But obviously, if Minnesota gets to 13-0, not a problem. They're in the playoff.
All right, but if Minnesota you're sort of saying, you're shrugging your shoulders a little bit on Minnesota, then why at that point in time wouldn't you put Oregon ahead of Penn State? Oregon loses a very close, hard-fought game, essentially on the road to Auburn, which is a really, that's not a terrible loss there. Why wouldn't Oregon be ahead of Penn State?
Well, I mean, Penn State's loss is the same kind of a thing. The game went right down to the final play. And, Penn State came up short, but Penn State's wins are better than Oregon's wins because the Pac-12, there were no ranked teams other than Oregon and Utah. There probably won't be any ranked teams this week unless, say, Washington or USC squeezes onto the bottom, which seems unlikely. So, the best team that Oregon has played so far beat them. And that's also true of Penn State. However, Penn State has also wins over teams that are in the rankings in Michigan and Iowa. There you go.
All right. Jerry Palm, good job there. We're starting to get these rankings that are coming out. We're also having our guy. Let's get more folks in here to talk about this and see exactly what we're doing there. There he is, Chip Patterson. Love having him aboard. Chip, let me start with the same question that I started with Jerry. If this was a committee of one, after you got through LSU, Ohio State, and Clemson, who would be your 4 team? Would it be Bama? Would it be Georgia, Penn State, Oregon, Minnesota, Utah? Who's the 4 team on your board?
It would be Alabama right now, though I don't think it'll be that forever. And it's constantly coming back to the conversation of balancing between best and most deserving. Because when you look at Alabama, there's not a lot to suggest that they are deserving. They don't have a lot of quality wins. Their strength of schedule has not been great, but best does matter. And the selection committee is asked to put the best teams in there. And this one loss that Alabama has was with a banged up Tua, and against the best teams in the country in LSU. So I'll go LSU, Clemson, Ohio State, and then I'll have Alabama in there as my number 4 for this week. But I'm looking ahead, and I think that there's an opportunity for an Oregon. There's an opportunity for even an Oklahoma, and yes, an opportunity for a Minnesota to be able to climb up in there and join that group. But I think that right now, you just cannot knock Alabama all the way out of this based on strength of schedule alone when we are asked to pick the 4 best teams. And with Tua, Jerry Jeudy, Devonta Smith, Henry Ruggs, Najee Harris, I mean, this team can outscore about anybody in the country, just not LSU. So I'm going to keep them in the top 4 for this week if it's a committee of one, though I understand that as we get the full body of work together, best maybe matters a little bit less and most deserving matters a little bit more. But right now, here on this Tuesday, the 12th, I'll keep Alabama at 4.
Chip, you mentioned Tua and the injury. Do you think the committee will at all be sympathetic to that? Do you think that they will look at this loss and not necessarily throw it out? No one's expecting that. But will the markdown not be as severe because Tua wasn't 100%, or do you not think that they'll consider that?
This is the thing that drives college football fans crazy, EK, because the answer is Tua's injury matters unless it doesn't. If they want it to matter, if they want it to be a tiebreaker, then it can be a tiebreaker and it can explain away that LSU loss. But, if we're splitting hairs at the end of the season and Oregon has just toppled a top 10 ranked Utah in the Pac-12 championship game to finish 12-1, winning 12 consecutive games after that season opener on a neutral field against Auburn. And by the way, y'all remember game control? Oregon had a whole lot of game control in that Auburn game. But if you want that Tua injury to really matter and help explain away the loss to LSU, it can be there. It drives college football fans crazy. I think it only matters if they want it to matter.
All right, we are starting to get teams 10 on the way in. They're being revealed. Teams just outside this top 10. Michigan was 15, Wisconsin was 14, Baylor undefeated. They're playing home against Oklahoma. They were 13, Auburn 12, Florida 11. Then, boom, Oklahoma is at 10. Again, they're going to play on the road at Baylor, who's 13 this week. Penn State is 9. Minnesota, who beat them head-to-head, is ranked higher. That's how I would have had it. I would have Minnesota ahead of Penn State. Head-to-head is a thing, right? and then Utah at 7. Look, trying to find a way to get through this thing in the Pac-12. Utah and Oregon maybe on a little bit of a collision course there to see. So when you see 7 through 10 and who didn't make the top 10, let's go to Jerry Palm first. You got an initial reaction to where we are as we're at like 7 all the way down?
Well, yeah. So as we just talked about, head-to-head being a thing, but not everything. In this case, it's everything, because Penn State's resume is clearly better than Utah's. It's clearly better than Oregon's. But Minnesota beat them, and Minnesota's resume is not clearly better than Utah's or Oregon's. So they decided that Penn State had to be below Minnesota, so they moved Penn State down below teams that really their resume is better than.
Chip, you got any problem with what you see 7 through 10 and the teams that are just outside the top 10?
Baylor Bears. We've got an undefeated team out there, right? I mean, are they just sort of left out to dry? Oh, man, I'm so glad that we get Baylor, Oklahoma this week so that we can finally provide Matt Rule's team an opportunity to get a little bit of respect from the selection committee. Because if the selection committee is willing to reward Minnesota with that kind of adjustment and that kind of leap in the college football playoff rankings from one week to the next, then that same opportunity is there for Baylor. Baylor's just got to take that Kansas State game plan, play a little keep away, keep the ball out of Jalen Hurts' hands, run the ball 4 yards a carry. You know what that does? Keeps you on schedule, gets you to a first down. I think this is a big-time disappointment if you're a Baylor fan. But again, I think you take solace in the fact that Minnesota made such a great adjustment after just one result that Baylor, with Oklahoma coming to town, could see a similar adjustment if it can pull off the win.
All right, the list is now out and it's official. Jerry Palm knocked the first 5 in order perfectly. LSU, number 1. Ohio State would currently be the 2. Clemson moves up to the 3. It gets interesting on what are you going to do at 4. Like Jerry Palm said, Georgia, that's where the committee went. He also said he would go with Georgia. I would go with Bama. Chip would go with Bama, but we expected the committee would go with Georgia. Alabama at number 5. Oregon is at 6. And then you saw Utah 7, Minnesota 8, Penn State 9, Oklahoma 10. Jerry Palm, your reaction now that it's out and what they've done through this week.
Well, first of all, I would like to caution, Chip, at least in terms of the leap that Minnesota made. The leap Minnesota made was because they had that much room to move, and all they needed really was one big-time win to do it. Well, they got that big-time win. Baylor isn't moving up 9 spots by beating Oklahoma. For one thing, Oklahoma's not rated as highly, but really Baylor's problem isn't so much strength of schedule, it's just that they're winning, by three, triple overtime, whatever. They're just getting by every week. I remember a year Ohio State won a national championship that way. But that, style points matter to this committee, and Baylor's not coming up with them. Having that big win over Oklahoma, though, certainly would help, but don't expect Baylor to go from 13 to 4 if they beat Oklahoma.
All right, well, Chip, your reaction now that it's out and you see the list, first thing that comes to mind is what?
Good news for Georgia. I mean, it's right there ahead of you. If you are able to take care of business the rest of the way, I don't think this is going to be the year that we see a 2-loss team in the college football playoff. There's just too many other good contenders up there. But if the committee is going to reward the Bulldogs, even with that ugly South Carolina loss, and give them credit for the quality victories, well, hey, you take care of business at Auburn, you get it done against Texas A&M, you beat Georgia Tech in your rivalry game at the end of the year, and you are in Atlanta with a chance to go and make the college football playoff. I have not been that impressed with the 2019 Georgia Bulldogs. I do not favor them in a lot of matchups if I was to throw them on a neutral field against the other teams in the top 10. But the committee clearly has a high opinion, and that's a good opportunity then for Jake Fromm and this Georgia team to finish strong and get back to where this season started in the top 4.
All right, so let's take a look at the bracket so you can understand exactly where it is. There you go. There's your top 6 right there. First 3, you can order them how you want to order them, but they got to be 1, 2, and 3. It starts to get interesting with 4. Georgia on that line, Bama at 5, Oregon at 6. I'll say this, if I could make one change to college football in any way, shape, or form, it would be this. If you didn't earn the right to play in your conference championship game, that weekend we should count it as a loss against you. It's amazing that Georgia would have to play LSU in a championship game while Alabama wouldn't even have earned the right to play. But if Georgia loses, we knock them, but we don't knock Alabama, who's sitting home on the couch. Just saying, not picking on Alabama. That would be the case with any team.